This lesson is part 2 of the lab in which we released the energy in different foods. I'm going to show you a sample calculation of how to do this. So first we have the mass before we burned the food was 0.97, and the mass after we burned the food was 0.22. So we're just going to calculate the difference here. So we're going to take the mass, then we're going to subtract the two numbers. So we're going to take 0.97 minus 0.22, and that equals 0.75 is the change in mass for this particular food. Then we have to look at what the mass of the water was. And in our experiment, every time I used 15 milliliters of water, and 1 milliliter of water is equal to 1 gram of water. So this value is going to be 15 for all of the foods that we've tested. We have our initial temperature of 24 degrees and our final temperature of 38 degrees. So the difference between those two, we're going to subtract, and we're going to get a 14-degree difference between the final and the initial temperature. So now we're going to do a calculation here. We're going to take the mass of the water, which is 15, and we're going to multiply it by our change in temperature, which was 14. And then we're going to take all of that and we're going to divide it by 1,000. So when we do that calculation, make sure that you do the top part first and then divide it by 1,000. And we get an answer of 0.21. Then we're going to take this this is what we just calculated here. So we're going to take our 0.21 and we're going to divide it by the initial mass of our sample, which was 0.97. And when we divide that, we are going to get a final answer of 0.216, which I'm going to round to 0.22. So this value right here is the amount of energy in kilocalories per gram of our sample of food. These are the numbers that you're going to use to compare the different foods and how much energy was released in each of those foods. So when we scroll and look down further, this is just kind of a scrap paper worksheet if you need a little bit more room to work out those calculations. Then we have these assessment questions here. And I've given a little bit of information for these. So when you look at these particular questions, these are basically a claim evidence reasoning is what you're writing here. So in your claim, you are going to summarize the 3 foods that you tested in the order of how much energy was released. So you're going to kind of prioritize those and talk about how much energy each food released without using numbers. So there are no numbers involved in this first part. This is just a summary of how much energy they release. So rank them in order, maybe from top, the one that released the most energy, down to the one that released the least amount of energy. The second part here is where you talk about the numbers. So for this part, the evidence, you're going to use data from the lab, you're going to use the calculations, and you're going to say the one with the most released, whatever your value was that you calculated, and the one with the least released, again, you're going to talk about your calculation there. So this evidence part is where the numbers come into play. This third part here, what you're going to do is you are going to try and make a connection between what you learned in the lab, so the food with the most kilocalories per gram of energy, and the food with the least. And you're going to try and think about why you think that happened. Why was the food that had the most, how is it different from the other foods? Was it made of different molecules? You're going to think about carbohydrates and fats and look at how much energy was available in those particular foods and try to make some generalized statements for both questions 13 and 14. connecting what you found out in the lab with what you've learned in class about carbohydrates and fats. You will probably need to look up the carbs and the fats for each of the foods that you've tested. You can use the Calorie King website again, like we did previously, to look at foods, and you can find out the carbs and the fats, and I want you to draw some conclusions there. There are a couple other lab questions that you will want to answer. These right here being the most important. This is your conclusion for the lab, your claim, evidence, reasoning. I've just spelled it out for you in these questions to break it out. And then there are a couple of other questions that you are going to think about how much energy is released. You're going to try and label this graph. And then you're also going to think about this last question. If you thought that was efficient, the burning of it, did it release all the energy? Do you think there was energy left in the ash? Why or why not? Okay, so these two right here, questions 3 and 4, should both be a paragraph. It should not be one quick little thought. This is where you're really making the connection between what we saw in the lab and what you've actually learned in class so far with the science. Good luck.